Well, personally, I find it hard to imagine that the Iranians would be rushing back into peace negotiations. They are, however, at an existential moment of truth about the very future of this regime, which has not been the case for the last 50 years. Now, thanks to the Israeli actions, the regime is on the ropes. And unless they can respond in kind or find some other escape hatch from this, that is convincing to their people that the Iranian regime remains strong and is able to deter and defend against attacks, they've got an internal problem, and we may be facing soon the possible collapse of the regime. And I think, frankly, were they to rush into talks under pressure like this to capitulate and be flexible in the ways they were before, would be an admission to their own people about their own vulnerabilities and weaknesses. So I doubt very much that will put off this moment of truth. If they can't respond in kind to the Israelis, and so far they've been unable to do that, to penetrate significantly Israeli air defenses, they have a real problem at home.
Does that go to the argument, Ambassador, that while short-term goals in terms of delaying or destroying some of those enrichment capabilities may have been achieved, that this potentially, in that sort of existential sense, just pushes Iran towards more conviction that it does need those capabilities?
Well, that's one theory. We don't know that they may rush across the nuclear threshold. They're, 2 minutes from midnight anyway in terms of nuclear capability. And I think that, frankly, we have sufficient intelligence to know that they are moving in that direction. And that may be one of the triggers that would compel President Trump to consider actually aggressively joining the campaign, so that our capabilities are brought to bear and not just the Israelis, to prevent that from happening.
One of the arguments, of course, in terms of the timing is the perceived weakness of some of those Iranian proxies. And as a former ambassador, when it comes to Lebanon, what do you see as the state of those proxies at the moment in terms of the ability and willingness to respond?
Yes, I was just in Beirut and Israel a few days ago, in fact. And, of course, we had no inkling about what was going to happen. Hezbollah is definitely out of options. They really are unable at this point to exercise any meaningful influence within Lebanon, let alone pressure on Israel. The problem was in the Lebanese internal scene that whenever the United States and Iran appear to be talking, it freezes our allies and Iran's allies. No one wants to compromise. No one wants to take risks without knowing where power is going to end up in the Middle East. That just changed. And so I don't think Hezbollah can play a waiting game in terms of disarming their militia, which, of course, they themselves volunteered to do as part of the ceasefire agreement at the end of last year. So I suspect, and we should be encouraging our friends in Lebanon to really move forward quickly with finalizing the ceasefire so that Lebanese can move on to a more stable and peaceful environment.
You mentioned, of course, the domestic issues that Iran could face from here. How much is it for the supreme leader, not just about keeping the nuclear progress for his country, but also just achieving his own survival at this point?
I really do think that's the key question. And I think analysis, at least in the United States, hasn't really caught up with that reality. We're still sort of analyzing, what does the escalation mean for the region? And obviously, that's the key question. But if you look at the options he has, he can either respond in kind with attacks on Israel. That isn't working. He can try to attack American bases in the Middle East. That would draw the United States into the war, which is hardly in his interest. He can go after Saudi or Emirati oil installations, but I think that also would reinforce to his public that he can't deal with a real threat, which is not them, but rather Israel. Or he can rush back into negotiations, which also looks like weakness. So I think he's facing a real problem. And the regime was already sort of in the twilight period. No one quite knew what was going to happen after this aged man dies. Now the real pillars of the regime were the IRGC and the security establishment, and they are decimated. There's no longer any command and control, including, most importantly, the 3 million Basijis, the thugs who are paid by the IRGC to really enforce the will of the regime against the populace. And if they're not paid and if they're not directed by the regime, they will melt away like an ice cube.
talking about domestic issues, of course, we know that President Trump faces his own. We have seen the protests around the immigration in that country, but now President Trump also wanting to impose more travel bans on other countries, including on partners such as African nations, not to mention Pacific Island nations, which we knew it was really a matter of influence between Washington and Beijing as well. When it comes to the Middle East, do you see any other spheres of influence growing other than the key players that have been in the game so far? The influence of China, for example, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, Iran as well.
Well, when there's a lot of hype when Saudis negotiated a deal between the Iranians and the Saudis to reestablish diplomatic relations. But after that happened, we really haven't seen the Chinese play a significant diplomatic role, including during this critical period of conflict since October 7, 2023. Instead, they've been absent. Their interests are really commercial. And so they may do things behind the scenes, but they're more likely to lay low. The interesting question is the comments about Vladimir Putin and the Russians, who have traditionally tried to boost up the Iranians, but might try to curry favor with the United States by trying to play some kind of broker role. They do have good relations with the Israelis, in part because of the large Russian Orthodox population there. But Putin's not a peacemaker, so it's hard to picture him really seriously exercising his influence on behalf of stability in the Middle East. To the contrary, they've been a minor player in helping to destabilize places like Syria.
We're hearing now from President Trump speaking to reporters saying that it's time for a deal. We'll see that happens. He's tweeted that a deal can easily get done. He's, of course, promised no new wars in the Middle East. I do wonder, what are the options that are available to the President, to the White House now in terms of US involvement and how it can influence what happens next?
Well, we know President Trump is not a warmonger. He does not seek out occasions in which to exercise American military power if it's going to jeopardize American lives needlessly. He's also, a deal maker, although during the course of these negotiations, he and his entourage have changed the goalposts frequently, and that's been confusing, I think, to the American public and perhaps to the Iranians themselves. But to my mind, if you're asking my advice, I would say the last thing we should do is rush into negotiations and give a sort of jolt of, oxygen to the regime. Instead, we should keep the pressure on. And our role in that would be not to join in militarily, but to really bring down the ability of the Iranians to export oil. The sanctions have not been fully enforced. They've gone down from 1.7 million barrels a day to 1.1. We had it down to 300,000 when I was undersecretary. They should do that to the maximum extent possible and build an alliance based on the clear Iranian behavior that is so hostile and aggressive in the region, including at this G7 summit, so that we're closing all avenues of relief to the Iranian regime. So the Israelis may be moving militarily. Our task should be political and diplomatic pressure, not opening opportunities. Later on, the Iranians are really feeling the squeeze. Then you might offer an incentive.